Welcome back from lunch. Hope you enjoyed it. I have the pleasure to now introduce the session host of our last session, my colleague Erika Nijinsky, who is a professor of architectural history. And she is the only session host without a DDes degree, but we won't hold that against her. She does have a PhD from UC Berkeley, so it's fine. Her research interests include Baroque and Enlightenment architecture, early modern aesthetic philosophy, theories of public space, and critical traditions in architectural history. She is the current director of the PhD program, and as that, she has a seat at the table at the DDes Council. We very much enjoy her presence there, right? I don't want to bring up, she does teach core classes. She teaches some very interesting seminars that have intriguing names. The Shapes of Utopia. Another one is the Piranesi Effect. Yet another one would be Versailles to the Visionaries. I love these names, and they're intriguing seminars. One of her books, I think maybe the one I want to mention here, is called Sculpture and Enlightenment. It discusses questions of public art and architecture at a time of secular rationalism and revolutionary politics. Sounds very timely, actually. So please welcome Erika Nijinsky.
It's very funny, Martin, and unfortunately I've been cast as one of the talkers and not the doers, which is sort of true. But actually, I have to say that one of the pleasures of being a PhD is that over time we become good listeners, and we're going to have a chance to listen to your words of wisdom today and to turn the doers into talkers. At any rate, the title of our last session today is Academic Leadership, the Future of Design Research. And under that general and sort of ambitious rubric, which I think you'll agree underscores the really remarkable caliber of minds and actions that have been shepherded over the decades by the DDes program. I did think to sort of suggest some general prompts to our speakers for the presentations. Really this was intended as a way to weave the work and achievements of our distinguished panel into broader questions that have to do with the collision and coalescence of, on the one hand, the experimental setting of the knowledge produced by the DDes, and on the other hand, the way the academy writ large forges a place for the design disciplines. We're going to have the opportunity this afternoon to hear from DDes alumni who, as leaders in their fields, as well as professors, directors, and deans, are really singularly equipped to tell us something about those modes and structures of design research and pedagogy that have been successful or not, and why, or some of the educational ventures and curricular developments our speakers have put into place and their outcomes, or the various connections to be made that design research, in fact, has instigated between academic institutions and the real world of practice or policy, or even how the concept of design research itself has changed and is continuing to change. So with that set of broader themes and prompts in mind, I'd like to remind everyone of the format before I introduce our first speaker. Each of our presenters will have about 15 minutes for their talk. We will then have the privilege of welcoming Michelle Addington as respondent, and a brief Q&A will follow. So our first speaker this afternoon is Jeffrey Huang, who holds joint professorships in architecture and computer science at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, or the EPFL, where he also serves as director of the Media and Design Lab. Before this, he was a faculty member at MIT's Sloan School and the GSD. And between 2013 and 16, he bravely took on the deanship of SUTD, which was a new university in Singapore established with MIT. Professor Huang's research considers the intersection of physical and digital architecture. He also heads the strategic design firm Convergio. Please join me in welcoming Professor Huang.
Thank you, Erika. Good afternoon. It's a true pleasure and privilege to be here, to see so many friends and familiar faces. So thank you, Martin and Peter and Antoine, for having me back. I finished my DDes exactly 20 years ago, in '97, with Spiro Polalis and Carl Sapers on my thesis committee. And I joined the GSD as a faculty then after and advised and co-advised about a dozen students, some with Antoine, some with Peter, which was a true pleasure. And many of those DDes have gone out to do really great things, and some of them are here. I then went back to Switzerland, as Erika already mentioned, but in 2013 to 2016, I took on the job of helping to create and lead the design of a completely new university in Singapore called SUTD, or Singapore University of Technology and Design, as the head of pillar, or the dean of the architecture and sustainable design pillar. So SUTD stands for Singapore University of Technology and Design. This is the 4th national university in Singapore that has been created as part of the government's effort to move the country from a port city to a logistic hub, to a financial center, to a knowledge hub or a smart city, and to encourage creativity and entrepreneurship. The university was established in collaboration with MIT. It's a completely new university, so built from scratch, an opportunity to reinvent university, completely unencumbered by legacy, so there are no dinosaurs around. So the question was, if you could create today a new school of architecture from tabula rasa, ex nihilo, what would it be? What would be its intellectual footprint? And so what I would like to do is share some of the design decisions we put into the design or the creation of this university, some of the challenges we faced, some of the lessons learned, and perhaps, as you will see, there are many parallels to the DDes spirit in this university that hopefully you will recognize. So we believe that future design and future design research, since this was part of this panel on academic leadership, will not happen in a vacuum. So to design a new university, rather than creating new structures, it is really to avoid structures. It is really to design, break boundaries, design or liquefy structures, design fluidities. As an example, fluidity, or we pushed the breaking down of traditional disciplines. This is a blueprint of SUTD, of the entire university. It's a university that has no departments. It has only pillars, they call it pillars. So there are 4 main pillars: architecture and sustainable design, which I was heading, engineering product development, which is about products, engineering systems and design, which is about systems, and information systems technology and design, which is about information systems, data, computer science. So students who go through that system for the first 3 semesters, which is named Freshmore, share the curriculum. And the sharing includes typical topics like mathematics, science, humanities, but also design. So everyone, the 400 or so students, all take the same design studio, working with each other. And only after 3 semesters, they declare which pillar they want to go into. And then, even at a later stage, when they enroll more to the courses that correspond to architecture, there are lots of transversals that cuts through, and a capstone studio project in the senior year that where a interdisciplinary collaboration is mandatory. So this kind of multidisciplinary or fluidity among disciplines allows projects like this, and there are many projects. This is just an example where a group of students from architecture and a group of students from product design came together under the guidance of Thomas Schröpfer, who is DDes from here, and Suranga Nanayakara from another pillar, to design this beautiful lighting installation in Marina Bay, so tackling together challenges of space, of aesthetics, of product design, of interactivity. We pushed also for breaking down the barriers between funded research, design, and teaching. So there is actually quite abundant research funding. The government helped to set up this design center called SUTD, MIT International Design Center, which is a research center with a budget of 120 million that looks only at design science. So I think, to my knowledge, is one of the research centers on design that is most heavily funded. And then there are other research centers like DMAND, Digital Manufacturing and Design, and Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Design. But the attempt was to break down the idea that funded research would happen in the labs, and to encourage this cross-fertilization between what happens in those research projects with teaching and design, even design practice. So an example, it's a project that started out in the lab to reinvent light, and then the collaboration with designers to create then a whole space. So this is a group of researchers that challenged the notion of light as a fixture, and rather to look at light as a field, and putting 6,000 movable lights together to create this almost ethereal space that casts no shadow. Another project where I was the PI, it's a collaboration. So there is a research component with the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT and the architectural pillar at SUTD to decode what we call morphogenetic code, and then to give that to use that in a studio to recreate architecture typologies, cities, and this is the project again where research, teaching, and design practice are feeding each other. We pushed also for breaking the boundary with what happens in the classroom and what happens in the real world. This is, I think, more common here in the US. A typical example, it's a project that starts in a classroom, but then in extracurricular time, during the vacations, it's continued by the students to actually build it. So this is a project where 125 students participated during the summer break to build this grid shell pavilion. So it's a parametric pavilion that was led by Andrzej Sevchuk, who's now faculty here at the GSD. And it's a beautiful structure that even won the President's Design Award in Singapore, which is one of the most prestigious design prizes. And finally, we pushed also for breaking the boundary between local community and university, essentially to get rid of the idea of the university as an ivory tower, and really to encourage students to explore opportunities in neighboring countries, in Myanmar, in Vietnam, but also in Singapore, to become, I think, what we could now call design activists, and do something. There are also projects in Singapore, such as this one, just to team up with the Chinatown community to create parametric goats. So 13 students created 338 each uniquely looking goats for the Chinatown light up, and it was one of the most self-feared sites in Singapore in that month. So there's this intention to break boundaries, But of course, it's easier said than done, and I think that the key thing, and I agree with the last slide of Chris Castle this morning, people matters. So you can have many ideas, many structures, but in the end, what is the right mix to foster this kind of fluidity, to foster this culture of breaking the boundaries, and so forth. Questions of what should be the mix between full-time and visiting faculty, what should be the mix between international and local, senior versus junior. Given the small size of the university, is there actually a chance to maintain a certain diversity, or is it better to keep a certain focus? So when I joined in 2013, there was 6 faculty, mainly selected or from MIT. And in 3 years, we increased that number to 35. So this was one international search after another. And it turned out that it is a mix of about 50-50 full-time versus visiting, 50-50 international versus local, but mostly junior, actually only junior, and with a focus on essentially what we do, technology and design. Happens to be that all the hires were digital natives, so born after 1980. I think all of them are quite good programmers, so it's create a bit of a geeky feel. But the important thing is really that coding is just another language for communication, another language also to break down the barriers to communicate with engineers and so forth. Very important for this conference is a fantastic cast of very, very good graduates, so especially Thomas Schröpfer, who was instrumental in helping to set up SUTD, Nari, who spoke this morning, and Felix, whom we recruited straight from the DDes program with the help of Martin about 2 years ago, and he's now really doing brilliantly. Geographically, Singapore is an interesting place to set up a new university because of the dense population, the equatorial setting, the tropical climate. And the question was how to leverage this particular context, also this readiness for experimentation, to create a unique, more unique identity. So if we have all those ideas of how to approach design, what for, right? Why would we design? And so it's also within Singapore, a particular location to the East Coast, in case you're familiar with Singapore, near Changi Airport. So the idea was to relatively quickly focus on the design research on challenges that are particular to Singapore, to look at Singapore as a microcosm. So we looked at conditions such as that of hyperdensity. So if you have a very dense population but cannot expand, the scarcity of land, shifting demographics as a condition, alternative energies as a condition, shortage of skilled labor as a condition, and as you grow, the preservation and adaptation and conservation as a condition. These are all topics, and there are more. These were just selected by the faculty based on faculty interest to marshal a certain direction. Of course, those topics were then addressed in an SUTD fashion from a multidisciplinary systems perspective, data-driven, and so forth. Of course, it's important to note that even though it's a Singapore University of Technology and Design, and technology is very prevalent, technology is never for the sake of technology. Just to throw technology at the problem doesn't make it better, or with more technology you cannot create a better design. On the contrary, sometimes you create worse design. So the emphasis, and this is something that Peter, who is actually on our advisory board, external advisory board, kept reminding us that the emphasis on critical thinking and techno-skepticism, I would say. So those topics became part of the thesis project. So last year we had our first graduates with 63 thesis projects, and I think I've some booklets that they are coming out, I think, or they just came out last week. So if you're interested in how SUTD students approach those problems, just grab a copy or at least take a look at the copy. This is the book designed by Hans Edge 55, and some pictures of SUTD in case you go visit. It's a UN studio designed with a similar fluidity than the program itself. Some numbers from 2013 to 2016. Just to give you a framework, we are now 35 faculty, about 200 students, will grow to about 275. Network of partnership with industry is very important. There are about 150 internships now offered to students so far, and research funding, there are mostly internal funding, but about 15 million for 15 tenure. It's quite a good number for design research. So the summary, it was an opportunity to create a new school of architecture from scratch. Believe that design cannot happen in a vacuum, so there was an emphasis on breaking boundaries and create design fluidities, creating or recruiting the right mix of faculty, and use Singapore as microcosm. Okay, we need to stop, but some open questions. Since we had the opportunity to create a new university, there are still some lingering thoughts of whether we were radical enough. There was always a conflict between innovating versus getting accredited. So there's a question of, do we need accreditation at all, or can we create a new model of an architect? Tied to this is also the question of multidisciplinarity. How far can you go? There's always a danger to be neither fish nor bird. Maybe that's an English expression, to fall into the cracks, especially if you're young on a tenure track. If you choose not to focus on your discipline, what will happen? These kind of things. And finally, questions about the value of the degree, the quality of the graduates, whether they will have impact in Singapore. Currently, this is a class of graduates, probably the first class of architectural graduates where everyone knows Grasshopper and Python. So there's a danger, do they overshoot the market needs, or is there a chance that they can infiltrate the profession and somehow transform the industry from within? We surely hope so, but only time can tell if this will happen. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Yu Wu, who is the Kyushu Distinguished Professor at Zhejiang University, where he also serves as chairman of the Administration Committee for Architecture Planning, heads the Department of Architecture, and directs the International Center for Architecture and Urban Developmental Studies. Many hats. In the early 2000s, Professor Wu was chief planner of Shanghai Pudong New Area, and in 2005, he founded Design Future Studio with the express purpose of studying the development of small towns in the more remote areas of China. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wu.
Thank you. It's my honor to come back to GSD with our GSD DDes family. I especially thanks Peter, and Martin, to invite me back. And, I gave this topic just yesterday. I thought probably it's a coincidence that D design similar to DDes. So I would like to share with you my reflections on about past 30 years. My experience. Admittedly, I'm fresh. As an academician. I just back to university as a full-time professor for 3 years. So majorly, I'm a practitioner. So what I would like to share with you is that the phase on design. When I came back to university, my students asked me how, Professor, how strong your passion can keep you for 30 years still stick in this field. I said no. Actually, I actually shaking my face several times. With joining this real world practice. Sorry. For this drawings, I think this is quite telling about what I would like to express, that this natural evolution and this is artificial intervening. My experience and understanding of architecture and urban planning mainly from my experience and practice in China. From a very lack of characteristic design to quickly to over-designed in certain point. For the past 30 years, especially for past 10 years, it become kind of a big gala, for designers to come to China to do, whatever, they feel, satisfied. And but quickly, this design, I feel a little bit, overly done, and so that's a trend, people trying to gathering all this, star architect together to make it even attracting, This is a case I think it's 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the communal by the Great Wall. But for this one, it's okay because the nature block the intervening of each other. Actually, for me, I think in many cases, the designers don't want to be with designers in a very, direct contact. But for certain situation like Shanghai Expo, I think this is very telling that when all these, self-expression designs come together, it creates the totality is kind of get lost or a bit messy, So, so my observation is a little bit, negative in a way that I feel for many designers is that we are very self-centered or enjoy small circle self-entertaining or, lack of knowledge background or technical power, or we should do something else. So this is probably the reason I came back to university so late, so the question is the purpose of architecture is to serve the client or realize the architect's itself's ambition, It's also a question for myself, So it's actually a bit pain to realize that in many cases, design is not so important. And in many cases, life may not need design, So, so I would like, share with you my past 30 years, this is my undergraduate study in Hangzhou, Zhejiang University, and then to Nanjing, and then to working in Beijing, and 5 years in Shenzhen. And then at that moment, I feel really a lot of confusing on urban planning, larger scale issue. So I applied the DDes here in GSD and studied the urban design and planning with Professor Rou, And after that, I came back to Pudong as a chief planner, where at that moment, Pudong is also the center of Chinese, open and reform activities, And then after that, I start my own independent practitioner, and then back to university, and also back to the same, start point of my career, and that's the 30 years of DDes, So this study actually was done when I was the chief planner in Pudong. I was really shocked for this fancy new community with such a large, blocks. Nowadays, everyone criticizes it, but back then, it's a very popular way of design, and with like a very empty, very artificial sense of, habitat. So this actually forced me to rethink about integrated or contextual design. So it's also a direct reason pushed me to start my own design practice of Design Future Studio. So I would like to share with you quickly, the works is like how a designer could temporarily put self, or me aside, and to embrace the very complex city of the world, and to have like more attention to the different regional character and culture. So that's the one I did in Hangzhou, the coastal of area of China, which is a quite a wealthy area, and frankly speaking, this is more like an urban design, how to pay respect to the context and open, plazas and introduce, courtyard inside. This is what went finished, and the local Xixi wetland also introduced into this design. What I would like to say is that it's still carrying some of my personal intention of to integrate my understanding of traditional Chinese culture, not very literally. That's my point is that, I'm not so fond of literary reference of ancient Chinese buildings like, big roof or white walls, but rather more abstract way, spirit, This is my grand uncle's, seal designs, and this is my paintings. And I think, although this is modern, I think it could be my understanding of Chinese, context. And the other example I would like to share with you is the one I spent almost 10 years in a very remote area of China. It's next to the Tibetan area. It's called Huangyuan. Traditionally, it's a border between Chinese people and the Tibetan people. So you can see that it's totally different culture and climate. And I have the chance, I get the chance to redesign 3 compounds of administrative buildings. And we actually replan and redesigned, open the gate, and programming all this first floor as a public service, and then came out as a physical kind of design, which respect the average kind of control of the city. And so that's the material, local material, and also we did the landscape design and sculpture. And the buildings actually gave away to the plants and trees. And so it's not like a new buildings, more mingled with the context of environment. And I have to confess that this actually is a fake. It's not a authentic traditional material, but I think this is the way it should be, because time is changing. So, and then follow up for many years with the regional studies and master plan, and so it's more like a testing, kind of work. We go through all the spectrum of design fields, and then know the local people and make friends of them. So then I'm gonna talk a little bit about, the design educations. How can we place, the position of design education into the context of modern higher education? Liberal arts education and solid technical training, broad knowledge background, interdisciplinary interaction, response to the real world of practice and leadership and teamwork is something on the top of my mind after these years of practice. So when they invite me to take the lead of the Department of Architecture and Urban Planning, I set up this value as the key, objective for my work, to nurturing, to nurture the adaptive innovation leaderships. So we set up 3 major categories of values, and then to trying to switch the orientation from knowledge-based to quality-based and skill developing to thinking capability nurturing and typological education to problem-oriented educations. So this is the basic structure of our undergraduate educations. We set up the first 3 years as a core studio studies with a more strict, technical training. Of course, the first half year is a liberal arts education. I think Zhejiang University is the probably the only one, the first one in China have the liberal arts education. And I guess we have quite a bit students, excellent students joining GSD by now, And the first year is open to the, variety of possibilities. And the 5th year is about more solid, real-world practicing designs. So in all these 5 years for the design courses, we trying to input some key points like teamwork, practice professors, and basic trainings and into the process of design education. So I just quickly go through. This is for the sophomore design, and this is for the 3rd year design, trying to introduce programming into this education. Because I really realize that we are in a rather low end of the food chain of all the built environment. So especially in the universities, for example, Zhejiang University now ranking like top 3 in China, the best universities. And for the past 30 years, we always hold the top 3 high scores in our discipline. How let this brilliant brain get sufficient room to develop? It's our challenges, So this is the case we did last year about a very complex real-world kind of urban renewal in Hangzhou, and it comes with a teamwork with a programming, study, research, and then to a smaller team of work. So, and also I would like to show the students when all their projects come together, it's become a expo, like a museum. It's messy. But when each individual insert in and help the existing context, it will be different stories. And so, and also the technical training is followed all the way, So I just quickly go through that. And this is the 4th year. We invite a professor from Australia to take a more kind of wild try on design educations. And this is the 5th year, graduating study with Spanish universities. And then we're trying to set up a new kind of framework to, that's the union, quite strange. We have like 2 design institutes together with 2 departments, which they can fund like sufficiently to our, purpose of education. So, so that's the function of the different committees, and Professor Rowe, always very helpful, and Paul Andrew is also our, honorary dean, and so, and then in terms of real-world practice, we are currently trying to establish this new system with like full-time practice professor and part-time practice professors. And thanks, sorry, for a bit more this time.
Our next speaker is Kongjiang Yu, who is professor and dean of the College of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at Peking University. He is also president and principal designer of Turinscape, an internationally heralded firm of some 500 professionals. His projects have received numerous awards, including the World Architectural Festival Award for Excellence, the ULI Global Award of Excellence, and the ASLA Award of Excellence. He is widely published with books such as The Art of Survival, Recovering Landscape Architecture. Please join me in welcoming Dean Yu.
So everything in China is heroic. So my education and design research also must be heroic, the mission. So Peking University actually is art and science university at the beginning. And, but we do have education in design, architecture, 1902, but stopped in 1950s. So the education really recovered when I come back to China in 1997, and followed by the architectural program. And eventually we merged together to establish this school, College of Architecture and Landscape. So that's a journey. The university itself is established 120 years ago at the crisis, China's survival. That's why, because of survival, China wanted a revolution and changes the whole system to establish this as the first university in China, the Peking University. But we consider the survival is still true today in different ways. That's why I'm considering that the education should to address these survival issues. Survival, we are facing multiple challenges. So first challenge is, of course, urbanization. You can see the massive scale of urbanization. 10 million people move to the city every year. And also, we have a survival issue of environmental crisis, water, air, soil. You can imagine, 75% of water is polluted. A third of Chinese city is heavily polluted, the air. And 2/3 of Chinese city is shortage of water, long shortage of water. So these are all issues of survival. And cultural identity, that's another survival issues. We don't know where it's going to have our own identity. And of course, we have to evaluate. We need a new value system. How can we define this new value system? The whole Chinese society is, at this time, is transitional. You can see a new value, the aesthetics. I always use this word, big feet, little feet. We have totally, we're still not even modernized in terms of aesthetics. I mean, with little feet, big feet, still we enjoy these little feet aesthetics, which been a heritage for a long time. And now we say we need new aesthetics. What does that mean, design? What does it mean for design? That's you needed the whole system of value. You know, what is beautiful? We don't even know what is basic. It's a basic value. You know, what is beautiful? What is ugly? Right now, today, to my opinion, you can see this is what you have seen, what you will see in China when you travel in any cities. It's aesthetics value. It's fairly basic things. So it's time for a revolution. I call it Big Feet revolution. And this is our mission. This is a mission of design education, design research. And design research and education as a way to continue the movement, the new vernacular movement, which was happening about 100 years ago, but it stopped during the process, you know, because of many other survival issues happening in China. So what does that mean for design? What does that mean for urbanism, for architecture, and for landscape? What's the new civilization? We call it eco-civilization. So the adventure, when I came back to China in 1997, it's really adventure. And to try to do that, we need to find a model. How can we solve the problem? You know, we have so many things to do. So this I found is a problem which I found effective in the past 20 years. I've been using this model, learning by doing, by testing, and replicate across the scale. That's why we established a company called Trunscape. And I actually use this company to sponsor the school at the beginning. And the school, then we have the students will feed back to the company. That's why my company now grew up to 500 people. But at the same time, we have the school grow from 0, now have 200 in-house in every year. We have about 60 students. And at the same time, we established a pure research group. So you have practice, you have education, you have research. So practice will feed money and questions, which means this will serve the society, and this practice will know what the society need, what's the problem, how can we, what's the problem, what's the challenge we have to solve, and then go back to the school for the education, graduate students. And if the student need more questioning, we will looking for the research group. So that's 3 parts of this machine we are testing. Is an experimental model. Now that's, for the past 20 years, I was able to put the school above the practice. Jeff, you visited my Trunscape. So above this university is a school, and underneath is actually the practice. So it's an adaptive model to the challenges we are facing today in China. And what we do is across the scale. So the first one is from X larger to small, from the national planning all the way to urban and the installation, the buildings. That's the national scale planning. It's a combination of design and research planning across the scale and find the solutions. So conventionally, the solution are all great infrastructure, you know, pipelines, a sewage plant and dam and dikes. So what's our solution? What's a new solution we call the eco solution or nature-based solution to solve today's urban problem in China? We call it alternative solutions. For the past 20 years, we tested these green solutions. And for example, this is a city about 10 square kilometers in size. Normally, we use we level down the ground, put the pipes, put the highways, pipes, everything, great infrastructure. Well, in this case, we want to build a city without pipe, no pipes, and we want to save the water, so recharge the aquifer, and clean the water by the green infrastructure. It's built. You can see no pipes. The city become totally revolutionary. And this year, the whole city of Wuhan has been flooded. But this part is not flooded because we use an alternative solution, use green solution. And this model been replicated, become called the sponge city in China, become a national movement. You can see it's been built. So that's planning thinking. How can we find an alternative solution to solve today's China's problem, water problem, soil problem, transportation, green transportation solutions. And what about design itself? Design as an experiment, as a research tools. For example, this is our design solution. Peter wrote an article about this one in Shanghai Hotan Park. We tried to find a solution to solve these problems, water pollutions. 75 surface water is polluted like that, but all the pollution actually fertilizes. So how can we close the cycle? Instead of use sewage plant, how can we invent something that can be productive while at the same time you can clean up the water? So that's the test. And it was very primitive. Learn from farmers, the peasantry. You can see the organic process of use water to irrigate the field, and the field become productive. So that's the site. It's a Shanghai Expo site. It's a process, and it's built, and harvesting, biodiversity come back, and the clean water also produced at the same time. Now this practice, this design become an experiment. So we send a student for 5 years, or PhD student and a graduate student go to the site to investigate, to evaluate. The post-operational evaluation, you can see actually how it works. So POD, TOD actually reduced dramatically. And this another solution, we also, how can we deal with the soil problem, the soil pollutions? Also designed as an experiment. We create this kind of sponge ideas, collect stormwater from the sky, and test it. How this design can actually can clean the soil. So, and changes the pH value. You can see is produced. And how aesthetically can be changed at the same time as a test. How pH value change, how the native habitat be covered, and there's a preference. The aesthetics value also been tested. And all this has been done by the students, by the way. So practice and student observation, knowledge production. So, and also we propose other experiment, other approach to solve the problem. For example, productive landscape, sponge city ideas, solve the problem of flood, a resilient design, resilient cities, and the post-industrial design to solve the problem of industrial site. And new ruralism, that's our new test. That new, we built actually Toonscape Academy now to try to transform these decaying villages, to revitalize it. Use a school. Actually, we create a school and not only just transform the building into very boutique hotel and attract tourism, but also we build a school in the villages. You can see Carl, my advisor, Carl come back to teach actually in the academy, and the village got catalyzed. We try to rebuild the rural area, the rural villages. Now there's a new hotel and these rural peoples. So it's a new model of rural-urban relationship. So that's a practice. In the past 20 years, Toonscape had served in 200 cities. That's our project. But at the same time, so our students' project, our student work thesis, the keyword you can see always related to what we are practicing. So we produce knowledge, produce people, and at the same time solve the problem, real problem, use models, use design models. And that's not enough. We want to transfer this knowledge to the decision makers. That's what we do. We send the letters and the proposals to the minister, even to the president, and he catches the idea. Sponge city. Okay, we can use a sponge city to solve the problem, and we educate the minister and the mayors. Now, this is one of my lectures to mayors. Hundreds of mayors listen to how the sponge city can be built. There's another lecture to the president, to the mayors, nationwide mayors. So design research, in my idea, in my thinking, is about how can we find the solutions to solve the multiple problems we are facing today in creative ways and in deep forms, not just shallow form. Deep form is we build a human desire over the natural process. Underground is an ecological process. Above is beauty, is the form, is design form. And that can be proven or can be tested and be replicable across the scales. And the future will be the continuous new, I call the new vernacular movement, the May 4th of China. That was started at Peking University. And it's the design and research and the education of the professional at Peking University should pick up continuous movement to change the values, to change the mentality, and eventually we can change it to solve the problems we are facing today. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Pablo Allard, Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and Arts at the Universidad del Desarrollo en Concepción en Santiago. Dean Allard is principal at Allard & Partners, as well as founding partner of Nueva Via, which focuses on the development of transportation infrastructures. And in partnership with the Pritzker Prize winner Alejandro Aravena, he co-founded the Do Tank Elemental, which tackles applied innovation for social housing and urban design. He then became National Reconstruction Coordinator at the Chilean Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. Please join me in welcoming Dean Allard.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating experience just to meet all our professors, classmates, and to realize the diversity and the myriad of visions that the DDes program has developed over these 30 years. It brings back a lot of great memories, life-changing experiences, and I'm glad that not only my friends and professors are here, but also my wife. That was a key component of that experience. As you have seen from my biography or whatever, I've been bouncing from practice in Elemental to government and then back to academia. And as you can notice, I added the Global South issue on this academic leadership and the future of design research. And it's not just because I'm one of the 3 little dots at the lowest side of the globe that it's turning around, but also because I think I'm taking a much humble approach to the same challenges that Jeff and the other colleagues have already shown. So the most important challenge for architects today is the redefinition of the role and competences of the discipline given the current economic, cultural, technological, and political environment. In a globalized world, where the immediacy of technology and social media have changed the pertinence of traditional design procedures, it is time for architects to recover a leading role in the reconfiguration of place, let's say the city and the territory, as the platform to design better futures. This challenge is a call for action for designers based in their technical authority and critical judgment over the variables that inform and take form in our built environment. Not as mere observers, nor humanitarians, without rhetoric, but conscious about our role and responsibility. The Faculty of Architecture and Arts at UDD, University of Development, as it's called, Universidad del Desarrollo, in its 25 years of existence in Concepción and Santiago, has internalized some of these demands, offering a growing number of lines of research in its undergraduate, master's, and executive education programs, along with advanced and applied research centers, which have put us in sort of as an expectant position at the verge of these challenges. So if Jeff posed the challenges he was facing in Singapore, I'm going to start by pressing the right button, and frame the ideas that determine architecture education, at least in the case of Chile, and probably shared problems on the rest of the Global South. And I'm going to develop this further. The first one is the burden of the territory, and I'm quoting here Nicanor Parra, one of our biggest poets. We believe we are a country, and the truth is that we are only landscape. The second contextual challenge is the scarcity of means, and I'm quoting here my former partner Alejandro Aravena when he says he says that the scarcity of means demands from architects abundance of meaning. The third element, the lightness of boldness. There is a certain science in the rudimentary otherness of underdevelopment that can also be an opportunity for disruptive socio-technological innovations. And the fourth, resilience as a condition. Architecture as a geographic response to natural risks. These conditions also are complemented by the responsibility vested in Chilean architectural schools that we both have to guarantee not only the academic degree but also the professional license. So the burden of the territory is something that it's there. The landscape is for America what the cathedrals are for Europe. This is a quote from one of our professors, Casus Egers. And you have to understand that in a territory tensioned by the dynamics of massive extractive economies and the unique potential for conservation, architects should internalize the long-term trade-offs of such dilemmas. Chilean economy is based in copper, timber, fishing, agricultural, and now lithium extractive production. These highly intensive extractive activities produce environmental and social impacts at a regional, even a planetary scale. Massive wildfires suffered last summer in Chile were in part exacerbated by massive monocultives of pine and eucalyptus in the Central Valley. And mining operations are contesting the use of fresh water in arid zones at the Atacama Desert, as you can see in the picture. So landscape is a concept that we each carry around us, as Germán del Sol says. Our future architects, and this is how to train, how to educate future designers, must engage and be conscious of the role as mediators between the natural and the built environment. This takes us to one of our biggest concerns, and I haven't heard about them yet, the millennials. Their attitude towards education and practice, not only in terms of their known anxieties, but also considering their challenges and also their responsibilities. Just to mention that 7 out of 10 students at higher education in Chile are the first generation of their families to reach higher education. So there's a lot of responsibility into those millennials. So how you engage them? How can you move in positive ways their technology savvy without detaching them from the territory and the place where they have to be designers? UDD's architectural program is based on an experiential educational model focused on applied active innovation, something that millennials love. Every studio at every level incorporates traveling and fieldwork oriented towards observation, surveying and representation. GIS technologies and Google Earth have enhanced our capacity to survey and understand the territory, but on the other hand created dangerous distance between the subject and the experience, particularly in students. This basic, almost archaic, phenomenological approach towards landscape and place is an inherent condition of architecture from the Grand Tour to the Prix de Rome. An experience-oriented education takes us back to the very essence of the discipline, the capacity to identify, give name, represent, draw the territory in order to speculate and operate on it. UDD architecture program is based on the conventional studio plus courses structure. It's a 5-year professional degree plus a 1.5-year post-professional degree. Sorry, the master's program. Undergraduate students in their 4th year have to choose 4 areas of concentration aligned with the 4 master's options programs: landscape urbanism, sustainable design and construction, generative design, and social innovation and entrepreneurship. Yes, social innovation and entrepreneurship is one of our core areas. Besides this classic structure, we intercalate a series of disruptive, intense learning experiences. Unique to our program, the so-called detonating experiences. that are intended to expose our students to specific life-changing moments, either departure points or detours on their expected future careers. These 3 detonating experiences are organized in specific moments along the extension of the studies, and they relate to 3 spheres of the discipline. The first year, at the very first week of class, the territory. Third year, halfway through their careers, community and material. And 5th year, expanded professional field. This is a moment when the whole school stops, and during 10 days, they have this intensive, immersive, kind of like workshop-like experience. Incorporating also, in all of the other courses, the university-wide values of academic excellence, public responsibility, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And I'm going to show you later something about these detonating experiences. The second challenge is the scarcity of means. And here I'm going to paraphrase Alejandro Ravena again. The scarcity of means has been working for decades, at least in the Global South, as a filter against arbitrariness. You're forced to be precise and pertinent in your operations, not only by the cultural and economic context, but also by nature itself. You don't do things just because you can. Abundance of means may lead you to scarcity of meaning. The other way around is that scarcity of means requires you to respond with abundance of meaning. This is very important in the context of an emerging country like Chile. Over the last 3 decades, just as we are celebrating now, so when the DDes started, look what has happened in my country. Chile has experienced a dramatic leap forward on its social, economic, and cultural development. Poverty has decreased from 40% of the population to less than 9%. More than 90% of Chileans live in cities now, so we are not suffering massive urban migration. We did that already on the 50s. Per capita income has raised from $4,000 a year per capita to beyond the $22,000. Covering most basic needs, but demanding now better quality of life and social justice, and that's why our government is going through quite extreme, radical social reforms. By 2025, Chile will break the barrier of underdevelopment, becoming the first emerging country in the Global South to guarantee universal access to formal home ownership, eradicating slums instead of urbanizing them. But there's still pending challenges. This picture is quite unique because most of the time Santiago is polluted. This picture shows only the new CBD, because most of the time people are struggling for more than 2 hours to get from their poorest areas of the city, segregated from where the opportunities are. There's a lot of safety issues, not talk about resilience, and social segregation. Yes, we have provided access to formal housing, but we have created ghettos that are paying back and not the right way. So what are we doing in this context? The search for significance implies for architects to recover their political role as agents of change. Even on our second-year students, we manage them to work and provoke the urban realm with the parking day installations. We challenge them to explore beyond the mere rhetoric speculation and commit them and their design process towards applied engagement. This is something that later on with the detonating experience too, exposes students to the complexities of the public sphere, community and political issues, instilling in students the importance of open participatory design strategies while reinforcing their technical authority and critical judgment towards practice. And then goes the third one. Detonating experience 3 on the 5th year is aimed towards grounding students into the applied professional realm by going beyond traditional internships or having practitioners as instructors. Here we involve both students and architects in a co-educational process where studio becomes a real challenge rather than a simulation. What we do is that we invite 10 architectural firms and groups of 10 students to join those firms for 10 days to compete in the same real architectural competition. This allows last year students to speculate and forecast from within the expanding possibilities of their careers. This video is just 1 minute, so it won't take that much time. It talks a little bit about the 3 detonating experiences. First week, first year students, they don't know how to draw, they don't know nothing, and we take them to the middle of nowhere in Chile, and they have to build their classroom, and then they go out and start registering, drawing, recollecting information, transferring them, and then explaining to their classmates and professors what's their stake on that landscape that they're going to be working on. Then, third year, that's not one of my students, even though I like her. It's working with the community. This is the meatpacking district in Chile. These are little restaurants that work in a very poor area, and they don't have shades, they don't have seatings, and the students here go get involved with the community, do a survey, and start prototyping, and then co-building and co-designing with the meatpackers this new plaza, this new space. And the third one, as I said, is bringing the profession to university, but not just by teaching rather than collaborating. And this is what we did last year for an international competition where we had 10 teams of students working hand in hand with practitioners and competing among each other. And what is interesting is that it created a sort of tension and stress that was quite compelling. The principals of the offices were much more involved than never before. And the funny thing is that the team that got our internal award got awarded at the real competition too, so we weren't that far. Then, and almost done, I'm sorry, the lightness of boldness. There is a certain science in this rudimentary otherness of underdevelopment, and also an opportunity for disruptive socio-technological innovation. By this, I'm showing this image of Don Pedro to the left. He's a woodman, and he hired these young architects who are teaching at our university, Del Solar and Sherwood, Grupo Talca, because he wanted to have these overviews in his property towards that amazing volcano there. And at the end, the architects learned more from his craftsmanship rather than what they could give him back. And the power of this capacity of boldness is that even if it's transferred to a different context, let's say Venice Biennale, it still has its power and its beauty. So material and technological exploration in our school is tied towards craftsmanship rather than the means of production, representation, or prototyping. This lightness of boldness liberates our students from any restrictions to design-build methods, allowing for applied research at every stage, during the regular studios, material design research seminars, and so on. We even have this year the first group of students, thesis students, that decided to develop their final thesis project as a design-build project for a national competition called by the Ministry of Housing for developing a less than $30,000 energy-efficient home. And this is being built as we talk. We're going to see if they get the award. And in terms of research, advanced research at UDD is driven by a commitment to applied solutions, incorporating science, policy, and innovation. Our Center for Innovation in Cities is exploring the hybrid nature of third world conditions, along with emerging technologies that could allow the development of disruptive leapfrog innovations. We don't get that much public funding because we're a private university, so we are also looking for other ways of funding. And we are collaborating with IBM, Telefonica, Siemens, the Santiago Metropolitan Government, and also taking advantage of the research ecosystem at the university, joining forces with the UDD Data Science Institute, in order to detect opportunities for symbiotic solutions to urban challenges. And I'm going to show you just one case. To the left is the socioeconomic map of Santiago, the darkest red, highest income, the pale yellow, the lowest income. And when you talk about digital divide, sometimes you think that the wealthy have access to everything and the poor not. But in the case of Chile, it's different. The map in the center is something we did with IBM, shows all the tweets in Santiago during one day 2 years ago. And as you can see, the amount of access to technologies and to devices, it crosses every social income system. So what does it sell? What's the opportunity there? When we realized that most of the recycling in Chile is done by informal recollectors that go around the city. And we made this call for And it's called, it's a project sponsored by the Santiago Metropolitan Government, when we made an open call for crowdsourcing 5 urban challenges in areas such as transportation, waste management, social segregation, sustainability, among others. Then we invited 50 technological startups to apply to the challenge, and the 5 finalists received governmental subsidies and technical support from our team. The case that I'm going to show you is this group of recollectors that joined forces with some application developers and technological entrepreneurs, and they created Reciclap, or Recycle APP. That is, in Chile, is called the Uber of recycling. What it does is that whenever you are throwing a box away, instead of doing it, you just open your application, and one of these recollectors that has his iPhone in the bicycle will know that you're going to set up your garbage outside, so you're going to meet, and it reduces the amount of waste management, trucks, and so on. So what it makes is that it shows the potential of the emerging technologies to capitalize the value of sustainable social practices, formalizing the informal waste collectors and reducing dependency on costly, obsolete infrastructure and urban waste management models. This is what I call the leapfrog development. So we don't have to go through the whole provision of sound waste management infrastructure, because we have a value in that poverty that becomes richer than what it was before. Last, because I'm on the red side now, but this is just 2 slides. Resilience as a condition, architecture as a geographic response to natural risks. Since Chile is one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of natural risks and climate change, it gives us the imperative to become a testing ground for disaster recovery policies and design for urban resilience. I was involved in the recovery efforts after the 2010 earthquake and tsunami. And from that experience, we are working at UDD in a series of research projects that incorporate design approaches, not only to land uses, risk reduction infrastructure, but also innovative architectural and landscape designs for resilience, in order to have fishermen not being displaced from the coast side, in order to have this community going back confident that they know the risks, they've gone through it, but they're much more resilient. This experience allowed us to begin a collaborative initiative with the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies next door, called Recupera Chile. And we are working and exploring holistic approaches to post-disaster recovery after the massive wildfires we had last January. Building on that experience, and with support from the GSD MDes in Resilience community, we prepared the Santiago application for the 100 Resilient Cities program 2 years ago. And now we're currently the academic partners for its recent development. It was just launched 2 weeks ago. So the Global South requires architects, designers, and researchers of excellence, committed to the public interest, entrepreneurs and innovators. They will open the disciplinary field towards new constructions, more complex, hybrid, more contemporary, and why not to say, more beautiful. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker is Isla Berman, who is Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, where she holds the Edward E. Elson Professorship of Architecture. She is also the principal of Scale Shift Design. As an architect, a theorist, and a curator of architecture and urbanism, Dean Berman's research considers the complex relationships between culture and contemporary technological, material, and spatial practices. Her published work includes Expanded Field, Architectural Installation Beyond Art. She was also the curator of a stunning exhibition on New Orleans for the 2006 International Architectural Biennale in Venice. Please join me in welcoming Dean Berman.
Thank you. It's great to be here, great to be back. I'm going to go through my background and talk about design research through that lens. And as a brief history of my own background in academic leadership, in the last 13 years, I've led 4 very different architecture schools in varying capacities. As the Associate Dean at Tulane University, the Director of the School of Architecture at CCA in San Francisco, and now also the O'Donovan Director of the University of Waterloo School of Architecture, and now for the last 8 months as the Dean at the University of Virginia. For me, the context for design research within each of these institutions operates in many ways at the nexus of the larger opportunities and challenges that are driving the design disciplines, and their relationship to the future of architectural and design education on the one hand, and the specificity that each of these institutions and their faculties bring to these questions. So at Tulane, for example, the very deep cultural and infrastructural history of New Orleans, the environmental context of the Gulf Coast provided the framework for different research endeavors, which included the River Edge Studio, which was a collaboration that I had done many years ago with Joan Busquet and Felipe Correa from the GSD, that was focused on the environmental, infrastructural, and urban evolution of New Orleans in relation to the fluid dynamics of the Mississippi River. This research was also continued through Urban Build, which was a program that I launched to be a multi-scaled laboratory for city research, as well as a vehicle to generate innovative design strategies and site-specific interventions to aid in the city's revitalization and future urban development post-Katrina. Its multi-scaled investigations went from the scale of the city, urban megaforms, mega-block housing proposals, to design-build prototypes that we did for the city, which were focused on culturally significant neighborhoods central to the core of the city that had been severely damaged not only by Hurricane Katrina, but also by a very long history of neglect and urban decay. These interventions were then situated within a larger context of global water cities research that acted as instructive precedents for recontextualizing the future development of the city. And Urban Build, in many ways, was looking outward toward the global context, as I said, of water cities, and then inward down to the scale of the single house. At the same time, we also launched a couple other initiatives at Tulane that I did with Reed Kurloff, who was the dean at the time. We started the Tulane City Center and also City Build. And these were efforts to not only resituate design research within the local context of an institution and its environment in the same way that the University of Michigan perhaps has taken on the city of Detroit, but also to apply the intellectual capital of the academy to the context within which it is situated to ensure that design research might also have a real-world impact. Architecture as a discipline and its forms of design research have changed dramatically over the last 15 years. And although this has occurred in many different areas, I thought that I might speak to these within the context of some of the themes of a conference that I co-chaired a few years ago entitled New Constellations, New Ecologies, which was an attempt to take the pulse of the architectural discipline across a broad range of practices in relation to 6 realms, in relation to matter, energy, ecology, form and space, technology, territory, and populations, all of which have been undergoing radical transformation that might be used to frame a discussion on the future of design research while presenting this within the context of my own academic background. So 3 of the areas that I wanted to talk about today, the first in relation to emerging technologies, second environmental issues, and the third on planetary urbanization. Emerging digital technologies, which includes a range of practices, mass customization, non-standard modes of production, scripting and parametric design, BIM, all forms of rapid prototyping, 3D printing, CNC fabrication, and robotics, and thinking the implications of robotics in relation to new building practices, interactive systems and responsive materials and technologies, as well as GIS and the amplified use of data in urban and architectural research, continue to significantly influence the present and future of architectural practice, having evolved from being simply representational tools invested in the depiction of existing models of architectural space to becoming significant performative machines that have transformed the ways in which we conceive and configure form, space, and material. These technologies have enabled the emergence of new parametric practices, emulating genetic and iterative dynamic evolutionary processes that function at multiple scales and in different domains. And these are radically changing the ways in which we integrate disparate types of information, material information and other information into the design process, while also altering the methodologies directly influencing both design and manufacture. At CCA, I had founded 3 project-based R&D labs on urbanism, ecology, and digital and interactive media to expand networks for architectural design research. Our media and digital craft lab, for example, generated a number of design research projects, including the exhibition called Flux, Architecture in a Parametric Landscape, that opened in partnership with the Smart Geometries Conference in 2009 that we co-hosted. This project, which I developed and co-curated with Andrew Cudlis, was simultaneously intended to be an installation on parametric design and an exhibition on new technologies on which we're currently completing a book. Which was initiated by the exhibition, but also expands its terrain. The project was also tied into coursework at the school, a digital diagrams theory course that I taught and that formed the conceptual framework for the thematic categories of the exhibition, each of which explored a set of spatial logics that have been transformed through advanced digital practices, and a parametric modeling class that Andrew taught that developed a series of generative models as precedent analyses of some of the architectural projects that were presented in the exhibition. The research lab on emergent technologies also supported digital workshops that we ran 2 to 3 times a year, in addition to biodynamic structures workshops that we ran for 2 summers as part of the AA's Visiting School program. The lab supported multiple forms of design research while enhancing our curriculum and enabling interdisciplinary collaborations that operated at the intersection, for example, of urban research and data visualization, as well as those converging material explorations with digital craft. So in this case, this was a project in studio that we ran on 3D printing and ceramics. When you're in Silicon Valley and you're working in an art and design school that also has a ceramics program, the notion of thinking how we think about ceramics within the context of digital manufacturing and fabrication was interesting. Digital craft investigates not only the skill required to control the range of tools native to digital design, but also the relationship between digital processes and the physical behaviors of materials, or the materials to which these are applied, advocating for techniques that incorporate traditional forms of craftsmanship and that extend and redirect the automated capacities of these technologies. Within this context, representational models are supplanted by working material prototypes, which I think is a really critical part of this process, that by replicating the tectonic characteristics and physical performance of actual building components and assemblies, contract the ever-widening gap between virtual formal explorations and embodied material practices. Other related opportunities that extended the design research in this area included hosting 2 Acadia conferences, one that I did at CCA in 2012, and then when I moved to Waterloo, just so happened we were hosting the next one at Waterloo in 2013. Beyond my work running schools of architecture, this broader context has also been a driver in some of my own work, design research in relation to a number of theoretical and physical contexts and projects, including an installation that I did at the Wattis Institute of Contemporary Art in San Francisco that was looking at art and architectural installation practices, and also the book Expanded Field that came out of it, and Urban Syncopation, which is a recent project that was an installation as part of Nuit Blanche in Toronto. The second category that I wanted to look at briefly is energy circuits and artificial ecologies, asks us to imagine architecture and urbanism as dynamic integrated systems that our buildings and cities be assessed not only in terms of their physical objecthood, but also in relation to their material processes and the multiple valences of their performance. As green landscapes are now routinely called upon to cloak the surfaces of the future urban agropolis, from the active generation of energy-producing artificial terrain to new forms of urban agriculture, to an abundance of vegetal cladding systems intended to mitigate or recycle environmental pollutants that range from what I might think of as the modernist architectonics of the thin green line to the wild jungle-like camouflage of the truly anti-architectural. We must interrogate the many assumptions that are governing our understanding of the environmental issue and our approach to energy and ecology within contemporary practice, and the ways in which these, our approach to these issues are unfolding through the reprogramming and invention of new architectural, infrastructural, and urban typologies. At CCA, I had founded an ecolab which foregrounded environmental and ecological issues through a number of different projects that also linked up with studio work. One was the Refract House for the Solar Decathlon that we did, and that we won first place in architecture, I was happy to say, since we didn't have an engineering program at the school and partnered with Santa Clara University. We did a project on sustainable skyscrapers with SOM. As a partnership, ran an agropolis studio focused on new models for urban agriculture and energy generation, and also we're dealing a lot with something native to California, the Drylands competition, which was established by the Arid Lands Institute in California. The conjoining of life-sustaining ecologies with material models of continuous energy conversion in relation to urban density is exemplified in Iwamoto Scott's futuristic HydroNet proposal for San Francisco 100 years into the future. HydroNet is a visionary infrastructural rhizome that attempts to connect the collection, storage, and distribution of water, power, goods, and people with a multimodal alternative energy production system drawn from local sources of water, fog, wind, and hydrogen. This redefinition of site, infrastructure, building, and program is also evident in a number of projects, including the Renewing the Salton Sea proposal bilateral office, an innovative remix of ecologies, industry, and leisure to displace what has become a hydrological cesspool for adjacent mono-agricultural runoff and mitigate water pollution in an arid landscape where water scarcity is a life-threatening reality. Our new understanding of architecture as infrastructure to recircuit matter and energy has also shifted our focus not only toward designing instruments that facilitate its measurable exchanges, but also toward amplifying the gradient flows, atmospheric effects, and sensory experiences of the microenvironments that we create, that are now reconsidered as primary material constituents, along with stone, concrete, steel, and glass of buildings and cities. We're asked by people like Sean Lally of Weathers to envisage architecture not only as an acculturated physical extension of the geological crust of the Earth's surface, but also as the bottom layer of an ocean of air, and to invest the same degree of design intelligence and invention into the organization of its thermodynamic, acoustic, and electromagnetic milieus. Or to focus design on the interaction of microclimate gradations, as in Philippe Rahm's Phase Shift Gateway Park in Taichung. A true landscape scaled, we could call it a Deleuzian body without organs, based on the local intermixing and artificial production of heat, humidity, and pollution as new occupiable environments. The last category that I wanted to deal with is in relation to urbanism. We could say that three critical paradigm shifts, planetary urbanization, climate change, and the accelerating transformation of information technologies are fundamentally reshaping the 21st century city. The vast majority of the world's 7 billion inhabitants currently live in cities, a percentage expected to substantially increase to 75% by the middle of this century. The effects of this phenomenon, referred to as planetary urbanization, are obviously enormous, given that contemporary urban life is responsible for 80% of the world's resource consumption. Climate change and environmental pollution will have devastating effects on these essential resources, while simultaneously threatening cities rendered vulnerable by the fragility of their inherited geographic conditions, such as coastal environments or low-lying environments, or challenged by the shifting socioeconomic dynamics and territorial migrations of urban populations. In the Urban Lab at CCA, for example, focus areas for design research included projects such as the Jerusalem Studio that was focused on developing a 7-kilometer border territory between Israel and Palestine, or the West Bank, to rethink political territorialization in spatial and geographic terms. And this project involved a number of collaborations, including working with the Mediation Group and the Center for Conflict Resolution at the University of Massachusetts, and the mediators involved in the Geneva Accord in Jerusalem. Other design research projects included an infrastructural project looking at post-tsunami Japan, and a project rethinking the decommissioned military bases along the California coast as a way of rethinking sort of wasteland recycling. As a counterpoint to work such as Alan Berger's Drawscapes that investigates our production and distribution of wasteland, McLean Cutter's rail banking project that speculates on the territories of the city that fall outside the proper conceptual and political limits, and Nicholas Demonchot's project Local Code that uses geospatial analysis to identify thousands of publicly owned abandoned sites in major US cities, to think about expanding megalopolises and rapid urban prototyping. These consider the effects of speed, rapid growth, and the cultural tectonic shifts that are affecting local ecologies, political systems, and definitions of citizenship. We're watching this kind of rapid urbanization, and yet we're not thinking about what it means to actually think rapid prototyping in urban terms. While new megacities erupting at an unprecedented pace are transforming Asia, and we just saw examples of that, rapidly expanding informal settlements across the global south and urban sprawl in the north are fundamentally reshaping the city territory of the planet. At UVA, I've started an initiative called the Next Cities Institute, which includes a number of different projects that are existing at the school focused on dealing with these issues in the global south, such as the Yamuna River Project, in Delhi, India, that we're currently working on, whose objective is to revitalize the ecology of one of the most polluted rivers in the world within one of the largest megalopolises, while at the same time redeveloping patterns of urban settlement in relation to the river to enhance public life. And this is a project that has become a pan-university project, and the first at the university, where we're trying to deal with other disciplines in engineering, environmental science, politics, public policy, design and health, et cetera, as a kind of experiment about how we really think transdisciplinary practice. Other design research projects within the Next Cities include the work of the Arctic Design Group, an interdisciplinary research platform that explores the architectural, urban, and ecological futures of the rapidly changing Arctic. Historic city models, including the 20th century automobile city and the planning, policy, and design protocols underpinning them, are increasingly unable to cope with many of these issues. These and other factors have rendered obsolete traditional planning techniques while simultaneously demanding new methods of urban decoding, new forms of urban research, and the invention of a new toolbox of spatial and infrastructural concepts and strategies with which to reimagine and redefine the 21st century city. I do believe fundamentally that the academy should be absolutely forward-thinking, and that academic institutions should be at the cutting edge of advancing the design disciplines through integrated forms of design research and teaching, and that professional design schools have in some ways a twofold challenge, and I'll sort of end with this. First, that they are always trying to find a balance between the dissemination and development of a broad skill and knowledge-based architectural competence on the one hand, and the kinds of specialized research and teaching that supports the creative performative work and research of its faculty and students on the other. And second, that as a design school, our modes of research are quite distinct. Historically, we've often borrowed models of research from other disciplines in the humanities, in the social sciences, in applied sciences, and in the arts. And it is only more recently, I would say, that design research as a fundamental practice grounded in proactive forms of experimental design practice is reconceptualizing our framework for research. In a project-based way. And I think I'll end with that as one of the most critical things that I think we can look at or do moving forward. Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce our respondent, Michelle Addington, who is the incoming dean at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin, where she will hold the Henry M. Rockwell Chair in Architecture. Prior to this, she served as the Gerald Hines Chair in Sustainable Architectural Design at Yale University School of Architecture, with a joint appointment at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Prior to her appointment at Yale, she taught at the GSD for a decade, where she inspired a generation of DDes students. Please join me in welcoming Dean Addington.
Thank you so much, and I can't begin to tell you how delighted I am to be here. I feel as though I have spent the last 20 years trying to explain to people what a DDes is, trying to defend it, trying to justify it, and I feel as though in the last 24 hours I have seen such an incredible validation for this remarkable program, and I'm so proud that I got to be a part of it. And I'm so excited to meet many of you, but also to see so many of you I haven't seen in a number of years. And before I give my comments, I did have two important thank yous that I wanted to get out there. One is to Peter Rowe. Peter was a professor, he was a mentor, he was my boss. He was a colleague, and he remains to this day a dear friend, and he's meant a lot to me, and his support has meant a lot to me. The other comes, unfortunately, I can only hope that Dan is, I'm going to cry if I do this, but I can only hope that Dan can hear me. But to Kay and to Ben, Dan, I am here today because of Dan's incredible support, his incredible guidance. And before I break into tears, I just want to say that one of the things I admired the most about Dan is that he found delight in learning something new. It was an infectious delight in learning something new, and I feel as though that was one of the greatest inspirations you could give to any student, any colleague at any time. Okay. Stop with that and go on. I'm going to start off by sharing two conversations that we had at Yale last year, because I think they really put forward and actually summarize quite a bit the discussion that we've had this afternoon. The first conversation took place almost a year ago this weekend, and interestingly enough, and coincidentally enough, it was when I was moderating a panel of deans at a conference that we had called Pedagogy in Place that was celebrating the 100th year of Yale's architecture program. We ended up in that, some of you were there, but we ended up with quite a heated debate in that particular panel between two GSD grads who were relatively, well, one a relatively new dean and the other one switching into a new dean position. It was between Amal Andros, who was just the new dean at Columbia, and Monica Ponce-Leon, who was in the middle of transitioning from Michigan to Princeton. And the heart of that debate, and you can see why it resonates with what we're talking about today, was what is design? Amal was talking about sort of expanding the field, all of the different areas, all of the different issues that Columbia was beginning to deal with in terms of design. And Monica came back with that, we've gone too far. That design is a creative process, that all of these things that we have reached out to, and she actually interestingly included fabrication in a lot of this, were a step too far, that we've lost sight of what the essence and the core of design was. It was surprisingly heated. I, for myself, always love a good rumble at a symposium, and it was good to see, but I think we were all quite unsettled at the end, because this is indeed something we were really questioning. What is indeed design? And then the other conversation, which had actually taken place just a few weeks before that, was equally as unsettling, and it's one that I had with at the time he was the dean of the forestry school, Sir Peter Crane. He's since stepped down. And it had to do with, he had really pulled back on a lot of the interdisciplinary studies that we were doing at Yale, particularly the interdisciplinary studies that we were doing between architecture and the forestry school. He was a very traditional botanist, and he felt as though that for the interdisciplinary activities had become a little bit too rhetorical, a little bit too frivolous, and that people needed to hunker down and deal with the criteria, the peer review, the focus that could only come by being sort of very inward-looking within your discipline. And he brought forward an example for me to show how frivolous design and interdisciplinary work with designers had become, and the project was the Million Trees Project of New York City. Many of you probably know, because this has a Richard Foreman legacy that was part of, put forward as a designed experiment, the Million Trees Project. And he was saying, it's ridiculous, that what is needed is probably about 12,373 trees of a very particular species in a very particular location. The idea that it's 1 million trees is so unscientific. It's not well studied. It's not well understood. And my argument for that was, 12,700, and I can't remember the exact number he used, would not get done. 1 million trees has traction. 1 million trees engages government, it engages the populace. It will get done, and it will cover your 12,000 trees. It's a way of getting something done in the world of the possible without deciding that it has to be that which is optimal. And I said, this is the value that we bring as design, is that we operate in the world of leveraging the possible to make things happen. And hopefully within that we can deal with the optimal. But the optimal is not going to happen. We deal with the possible. So I'm putting those two things forward because I think that brings together our talks this afternoon. And if I could sort of summarize where I saw, not really summarize, but put forward what I think the three key debates are that we need to bring forward about, actually does come back to that first conversation between Monica and Amal. What is design? This came up throughout. What is a discipline? What is the essence of the discipline? I'm interested in, Jeffrey talking about the lingua franca that they had defined, for their core faculty. It was at the lingua franca for what he wanted to do there, or should we also begin to understand what a lingua franca is for the discipline at large? Or do we even want to go that point? But we are at a dilemma in that we have a very difficult time communicating beyond our inner circle what it is that we actually do, what it is that we actually study, what it is that we actually contribute. We've not done our job in being able to define that to the outside world. Along with that, and I think it relates very much to this, and it's sort of an internal debate, but it came up as well in these talks, is this push-pull between academia and practice. We are really hamstrung, as we all well know, and we've been hamstrung for quite some time, by accreditation standards. And many of the accreditation standards are practice, basically enveloping and defining what it is that we do in academia. How can academia push back? What is the role that we have in relationship to practice? Are we the servants of practice? Are we the leaders of practice? Are we modalities of the larger discipline? But in terms of sort of how we negotiate that, it's not a question of just integration. It's not a question of just serving. It is sort of understanding what it is that we uniquely contribute to practice, what practice can uniquely contribute to us, but what we both can deal with in terms of taking that discipline much further than we have been taking it. And again, this is something that came up in everybody's talk in terms of how we push forward, how we push the limits, and how we move forward. But I think the one that crosses over everyone's talk is this issue of interdisciplinarity. And again, that relates back to the rumble between Monica and Amal last year. And as well, it relates very much to that conversation with Peter Crane. In terms of defining how we work interdisciplinary, we like to think of ourselves as inherently interdisciplinary. You think about a profession or a series of professions that crosses into multiple disciplines, even in terms of our educational stance, how we cross into multiple disciplines. But we've had for a very long time a way of doing it whereby we are folding in other disciplines. We might step into other disciplines, we might fold them in, but are we really sort of challenging what the actual network is, what the domains are? Are we operating in the cracks between these disciplines? Are we constructing the field that these other disciplines exist in? And I think this is one of our struggles for the 21st century. If there's any discipline, any set of disciplines that can begin to negotiate particularly contested territory, it has to be our discipline. We have that opportunity. We have the ability to understand these different contexts. We have sort of a variety of different means, methods, and tools in which to foreground questions that other disciplines that are more singular cannot begin to formulate. This is something that we can uniquely do. And I think within our schools of architecture, we're really struggling with how to get that forward, struggling with first what is a stable armature, what is a stable core of our disciplines, and at the same time, how do we reach beyond, how do we negotiate this new territory that the world needs for us to do so much right now. So I will close with that part, and I'll let Erica take it back over again.
Let me invite our speakers to the table. So I've been told we're running a little bit over time, but I've been told we have 15 minutes, and I actually don't think, Michelle, that you need to hand it over at all, because you threw out there prompt that I think I can turn over to our speakers and ask you to sort of ponder. As I was listening to all of you, this question of interdisciplinarity indeed came to my mind. It was fascinating to hear Jeff talk about avoiding structure entirely, thinking about interdisciplinarity as a given or as an a priori condition. It was then interesting to hear you talk about the context of things, about an abstract evocation of tradition, about what it means to consolidate a foundation, quote unquote, to introduce the liberal arts as part of an education. We turned to Kong Jian, who then talked rather sort of, in a very epic way. It was a beautiful sort of announcement about what a Bigfoot revolution might be, but at the same time thinking about a radical coalescence, it seems to me, of the school and of a practice, which is not something that we always see quite to that extent. With Pablo, again, we return to something that might seem to be a rumination over foundations in some ways. Experiential education in the sense of a phenomenology, but an attention to context that allowed him even to evoke something like the Grand Tour, which comes from the century that I study, and a commitment to the public interest. And lastly, with Ayla, you evoke transdisciplinarity and architecture's role, and this took me back to Jeff, as sort of an architecture or design school being able to think of the city to which it's related as a microcosm for a broader macrocosm. And, as the historian at the table, it fascinates me because I think we all come here assuming that institutions can create interdisciplinarity. And one of the things that I've learned by studying the past is that often actually it's historical forces that force interdisciplinarity in ways that might not always work. And so I'm just curious in your experiences, because I don't think we're going to have the kind of showdown that Michelle experienced. I'm actually hearing something here that I think is quite utopian, if I may, which is the sense that design schools can actually have both, can think about core and think about radical departures and somehow maintain in a pedagogical unfolding which moves from core to option studios to maybe thesis or professional practice, can actually find some kind of balancing act which involves a rumination or a pondering of what a core is, what foundations are, what precedents are on the one hand, and on the other about sort of radical experiments. So I'd like to think that actually maybe we're getting to a point where we can have a dialogue, or if not a dialectic. So I'm going to start out by asking you actually, do you believe that institutions can actually establish interdisciplinarity? And I don't know if Antoine is still, he's just walked in. Thinking again about the historical mechanisms of the ways in which interdisciplinarity actually creates wars or confrontations. Antoine is someone who's authored a book on architecture and engineering in the 18th century and how the first school of engineering actually sort of, gutted the identity of the architect in the 18th century. That wasn't about necessarily it was a battle zone in some ways. So I'm just curious, as all of you think about your roles as leaders in these extraordinary places we call design schools, what you think the institution can do. Can it be a framework for interdisciplinarity or not?
Maybe I can start opening it up. One of the things that's interesting when I first came to UVA, because the provost was very interested in interdisciplinary research, and to motivate that, we have this thing called a strategic investment fund, which is a $1 billion research fund over a 10-year period that our board of visitors controls. And one of the ways that they decided to, or that Tom decided to push forward on this interdisciplinarity was to basically put up seed funding or request proposals, but of course the proposals had to work across the 11 schools, had to have at least 3 schools involved. So for both pan-university institutes, I said the Yamuna River project, for example, is the first pan-university project, and because it is in part funded by this fund, that part of its motivation was to say, how do we develop and bring in other disciplines? And right now, it's a challenge. I mean, I just came back from India not that long ago. We got the go-ahead from, we're working with government there and the water board there. And it started in the architecture school. It was a 3-year project in the architecture school and is now moved to the university. And the challenge has been how we start first communicating, because different disciplines are operating, with very different models, very different languages, how we work across between research and teaching, because that in and of itself is an issue. And I look at it as a design problem, that we actually, and this is something that architecture can bring to the table, not just in terms of what we provide, but I think the 2 things that are interesting that are interesting from the side of architecture or an architecture school, on the one hand, it's actually to strategize about how we can remodel the program itself. The second is that we are a highly synthetic discipline. That so even with the Next Cities Institute, when I was talking about the 3 large bubbles, the bubble I didn't mention was design that sort of wraps the 3 in a way. And I think that part of that is also saying that we shouldn't be becoming dilettantes in other disciplines, which we have a tendency to do, but rather we have to learn how to bring others with their expertise to the table, and to talk to them, and to see how we integrate that into the design process. And I think that's a big challenge for us. But I can say that, that $1 billion as a seed, I have never in my life talked to so many other deans about so many projects from, simulation to technology, cyber physical systems, environmental science, public policy, as I have in the last 8 months. And it was because somebody said, well, I'll give you a certain amount of money for research, but only if you talk to each other. And I think, that was the challenge.
Yeah, following on your question about if there's any chance to have institutions promoting interdisciplinary, I think that this is the proof that we can. I mean, we've seen work from DDes alums in health, military, project management, education, and so on, housing finance. The question is when, during the development of anyone's career, because and Jeff mentioned that constraint regarding accreditation, and I also mentioned that in the case of Chile, we don't have an AIA that gives you license to practice. Once you get your academic degree, you are allowed to practice, and you're responsible for building structures that should comply with codes, that should comply, should not fall in an earthquake, and so on. So it adds a lot of stress into our curriculum, and it takes a lot of space for speculation, for exploration, research, and also collaborative work. So the question, I think, it's when. I think that graduate studies, or maybe when architecture students are leaning towards their final years, when they take some kind of concentration, that's maybe when you can start kind of like opening to, once you've moved from the core, that core that warranties those competences that society will require for an architect. If we're talking about architects, because we can have planners, we can have any other, then the beauty of this utopia for interdisciplinary collaboration is that my feeling is that the professional or the disciplinary field of architecture it's expanding, and it's not competing as it used to be with other disciplines, rather than creating shared value. And you can see it from what Kanjan just mentioned about infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure in the 20th century was engineering approach. You build and then you compensate damage to the communities, the territory, the families. And now it's all the way around. You have to create value through design in order to integrate infrastructure with the landscape, with the communities, and so on. So we are not just kind of like gardeners that are called after the dam is built to put some kind of like little planters. We are kind of like key players in the process in order to have all these interdisciplinary big projects being implemented. So my feeling is that I'm quite positive and optimistic about institutional capacity to create spaces for collaboration, because universities are in a certain way ecosystems, and they become much richer, and there's a lot of hybrid and cross-fertilization once you have checked that professionals comply with certain capacities, and then it's an open field. So I'm quite positive about it.
I think, of course, I think design is problem solving. The design solves a problem, and you cannot solve the problem just by singular disciplines. But it's challenging. How can you establish the identity of profession of design school as a promoter of a new culture in the university, which the university established based on this Renaissance, this modernism idea about disciplines, right? And the design school is really transdisciplinary, because you can see talking about this infrastructure. We have engineers, civil engineers, we have pipelines, we have all these single-minded engineering solutions. And design should be able to put them together. And in my school is a unique case, because I call it, it's adaptive to the situation at that right time, which urbanization happened, which in the situation which the university have no such school, and we have to solve the problem in a new way, quickly and fast. So in a university which is already have such disciplines, how can you establish yourself? I find it's challenging, it's difficult back in my university. So in a school, in Peking College of Architecture and Landscape, we don't have departments. At the beginning, I say we will have no department of architecture, no department of urban planning and landscape, because we are going to solve the problem across the scales, from national scale all the way to regional scale, to the urban scale, out to the community scale. There's no disciplinary. You solve this problem. Holistic, that's a whole system. That's one. So across the boundary, across the scale, and also you have to across. It's a system, right? It's a system. It's not a component. It's a system. So I think design have to be to build up this culture of multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary. Yeah.
Yeah, I think response to your question is that I think the bottom line is that education have to echo the real world practice, the need. So the real world is like, as many mentioned, is interdisciplinary. Of course, education should be prepared for that, for the future. And but I think we need to have a higher, demand than the bottom line. Architecture as a very, traditional major rooted in mainly on practice and professional, but how to put it in this academic, modern university system, I think it's a great challenge. For my case, the Department of Architecture always complains that the university don't understand our department, but now we think that we need return to understand the modern university educations. So, so I think the only way to have a great, brilliant future of design is to bravely break down the boundary of this narrow disciplinary. So we are now forging a new major called Architecture Plus. It's not from our students, but from an elite group of interdisciplinary school called Zhukuzhen School. They are not determined to any of department. But this Architecture Plus is not from like many actually Chinese architecture school currently build up a master, star architecture class. They introduce star architecture to educate the best young students, which I don't agree with. But our Architectural Plus program is like open to a more broader knowledges. Like we enhance the mathematics education, engineering education, and humanity educations, and also design and arts. So we have 4 clusters of knowledge to feed them. And in the future, my goal is that if they can be architects, that's good. If they cannot be architecture, it could be better. So, and so I think, as I mentioned, probably not, I'm not sure if I deliver my message that as a designer, if you only focus your own, then you will be forgotten by the world. But if you put yourself aside, then you have a bigger room to embrace the world. So for designers, I think they have a very unique position for the future higher education. It's probably the only platform can unify all the knowledges and to connect it to the real world innovations. It's actually, this is the beauty for my understanding of architectural education or design education as a broader concept.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand. When you ask about interdisciplinary, do you mean 2 people from different disciplines working together, or is it 1 person having multi-disciplines?
I'm asking you that question.
Well, I've been involved in many projects where people from different disciplines come together and label it as interdisciplinary, but oftentimes it's actually only interesting for one party. Let's say an architect develops an interactive installation and it's a programmer, right? So it's essentially it's service, but it's not multidisciplinary. So for the programmer, it's just cheap labor, or it's just a service, right? It's not challenging in terms of algorithm. It's not interesting in terms of how you structure data, or vice versa, right? That you have a material scientist developing a new photovoltaics and then needing an architect to make an interdisciplinary work. But it's also not interesting to the architect to put that kind of photovoltaic, or most of the times, unless you're very creative, on the roof, right? So I think it has to be, from a research point of view, advancing both fields, which is not easy because usually only advances one. But one way to look at that is if the challenge, right? So design is not only problem solving, but also problem seeking. What is the problem you want to solve? If the problem is not in one or the other discipline, but a third discipline, and it's going a little bit back to your idea of a system. If it's a systemic challenge, like the things you've shown, creating a resilient city, and that would require maybe different disciplines to advance, right?
If I could just add one thing, I think the notion of complexity and many of the problems that we're dealing with are so complex that it requires that we actually work together. It doesn't mean that we become the umbrella over many disciplines, but I think it's absolutely necessary. And in some ways, that's one of the challenges to academic institutions because of the way in which research has been set up as this sort of individual operation, the way in which individuals go through tenure processes, the way they're funded, et cetera. And that in and of itself is a problem in relation to the kinds of things that we need to take on. So.
Before I take a few questions from the audience, I just want to point out that here at the GSD, it's rather amusing. It goes back to your navel-gazing point. We have departments, but from the outside, from the view of Harvard University, we are the Faculty of Design, and I don't believe we quite live up to that. At any rate, questions from the audience? Yes, and then yes.
Chance to interview. So, like, when I was studying in Zhejiang University, I had a chance to interview Provost Zhang Daochang, the founding provost, and I asked him, like, you said that SUTD wants students who are best and brightest, but SUTD is not about to cultivate some math genius or scientist, and your kind of enrollment standard is not like China, like we did the Gaokao, like if you have high scores, you get in the best school. And so Provost Zhang answered me that he thinks like students must have certain ambition for what they want to do in life, and we want students who have passion to change things, and they are not satisfied about what exists. They always have the desire of how I can make it better. The desire is very important, and if you have that desire, you're the best in the class. But I really like your slides, by the way, but I'm surprised that I think it's very thoughtful and give us a good understanding of the structure of SUTD's education. But I'm still surprised that you have those numbers of like about how many students go to international architecture firms, those kind of thing, which are like very traditional evaluation standard as like an other universities, right? Okay, how many students find job, and how many students got good jobs, things like that. So I feel like, so my first question is like, how do SUTD evaluate graduates, because you are a young university, so how do you, so I already asked the provost, how do you enroll a student, what's the standard? So now my question is, so now you have a little bit of history now, so what's your standard to evaluate a student? And the second question is, when I asked Provost Zhang Daochang, I mentioned that I saw a video from Prime Minister Li Guangyao, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, that he said, because Singapore is a small country, so Singapore wants to get the best of the East and the West. And this is also the philosophy of SUTD, right? Get the East and the best. So that's why you guys are collaborating with MIT and Zhejiang University in China. You didn't mention Zhejiang University in China, but it's fine because it's in the US, people know MIT more. But my question is that when I was in China, I taught a workshop for SUTD students. I taught them I taught two workshops, but the main content is about Chinese, like traditional handcrafts, like how to make those potteries and, oh, sorry.
What's the question?
Yeah, just one sentence. So as China is doing this industrial transition and China's role in the world is changing, how do you evaluate the new collaboration with China instead of just the traditional culture? So two questions. One is the evaluation for graduates. The second is your collaboration with China. Is it changing or not?
Well, the first one is a bit tricky because of that dilemma with accreditation, with the tradition of the profession. It's also a good profession in Singapore. If you look at the graduate employment surveys of 2016, last year, architecture ranked in the top 6 or 7 among 64 professions. So it is a desirable profession. And it's also important, even if you don't care about those things, you just want to create a good school and impactful research and so forth. It's important because students look at those numbers, right? And so even if you care about other things, how radical people are, how cutting edge and so forth, but they don't get jobs, means in the next round you don't get good students. You know, the number of students you can choose from diminishes. So, of course, the ideal evaluation of the ideal assessment of our graduates or the quality of our graduates has to be the potential to have impact in 5 years or 10 years. Or,
I guess for speak from a board member's point of view of your organisation, the first graduating class did very, very well.
they did very well.
Yeah, and not only that, you shouldn't have been talking to the provost, by the way. I know him too. I can speak about his.
And if you don't get a job, just apply for a PhD, not a DDes. I think a gentleman. Oh,
Okay,
second,
yeah, no,
do you want a
second.
second part of the question though on China, the collaboration with China?
Well,
or-
first of all, of course, yes, we do partner with MIT and Zhejiang, and it's based on the philosophy of East and West, of course. But whereas MIT is a partner that, where they developed a large chunk of our curriculum, Zhejiang is more an exchange place where we exchange students to expose them to the Chinese condition, and vice versa, Zhejiang students to Singaporean condition. So that's why I think even though they're both on partners, MIT is really they're not on the same level of, they could be in the future, and they should be maybe in the future, right? As I think that Singapore is looking more to the north and east and to the west. I think it would be logical.
Question here.
Yesterday, Peter gave us a lecture, an opening remarks about design thinking. And today we are thinking about design. So that made me think of a couple of questions that I'm just bringing it up. The first one it's what can we say that the design can have? Well, first of all, we're discussing all this within an educational environment, okay? And you were talking about cracks and how to fill those cracks to see whether that design could go forward. Okay, so if that is true, can design educate? That's my first question. And the second question is, if design can educate, and within the academia, I would even take the question further. Can the academia take an educational role within our societies and design as part of it? That's my question.
So the first question is, can design be educated, or can design educate people? Educate people. Yeah, of course. I think when you look at a model, you see design can produce data. And when you look at data, people get educated, of course. So remember I showed you the landscape, how landscape cleans water. It's educational. You can show people, right? So design, if you design the form, I call it deep forms, the form you design can educate people how the water can be cleaned, how the soil can be cleaned, and how the aesthetic also, educate people. And also, can design education can intervene in the society? What do you mean? Yeah, it's the last question, right?
Yeah, design is part of the academia.
Yeah.
Academia should have a role within our society.
Exactly.
Should that
Well,
be,
yeah.
for instance, a political goal? Should we be proactive instead of reactive?
Yeah, that's when you remember my last slides, I show how 100 mayors listen to what designers can solve the problem. So I think it's certainly design, if we can solve the problem, we will convince the decision makers that they have to take this role. Yeah.
Pablo.
I think that, and I'm gonna quote Oriol Bohigas, the Barcelona guy. When I was in first year, he went to Chile. We were still in the transition from dictatorship, and he said that architecture and design were the most political of the professions, and we were, this guy is going to get kind of like tortured or something by the Pinochet people, and he didn't mean necessarily political partisanism, rather than design has a direct impact on everyday's life. It determines what you do, how you do it. Everything around us is designed by someone. These glasses, this me, this bottle, and in such role, it determines the way we interact, the way we live, the way we think, and that's the beauty of it. I think that definitely design is a way of educating, and also we can change habits in a community by means of designing a park, or we can teach people how to recycle by means of organizing through design the garbage collectors. So I think that it is education at its best. Now, the difficulty, and it goes to the very first discussion, is how do we teach and how we structure a certain way to transfer and improve the capacity of our students to design, and that goes back to Peter's initial design thinking lecture. So I think that how you systematize, how you provide a certain understanding of design in order to improve and be more conscious on the social impact that it has. I don't know if it...
And I think you have to, otherwise it would become useless. Who is a big designer? It's the president in China. The president, he's the architect, you know. In Mao's time, he said, we're going to build terraces. So whole China is going to build terraces for agriculture. Now today, Xi Jinping said, we want to build a sponge city. Now it become a sponge city movement. Billions of dollars invested in building a sponge city. So the designer is the president. So if we cannot influence the decision maker, we will become really hopeless.
Just want add something to Kong Jianyu's comment that now in China, the design in certain way really play a very active role instead of a passive role. For example, now the city I was in, Hangzhou, was regarded as a city of urban design, by the government, in a way that government actually go a bit further than the discipline or this major itself, But in a way that there's another danger there, The question is that, for example, I'm currently organizing a China Institution for New Urbanization. This concept of new urbanization is from central government. They want things better and in a more matured way. But how to define it, how to work it in a more like proper and right way is a great challenges. For example, like Sponge City, now I already get some different opinion for feedback, Not every city need to be a sponge city, For some cities, they need like a flooding control, let water pollution go, not absorb it, So yes, so it's a two-fold kind of things,
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
So in my experience, while everyone in academia speaks about the value of conducting interdisciplinary work, I think that academia itself as a structure is strictly disciplinary, and it prevents interdisciplinary work. And that has to do, to my opinion, greatly with the way that tenure evaluation criteria are being considered. And I also want to point out that I think there are, which is something that Jeffrey, I think, mentioned, there are two different ways of looking at interdisciplinary work. One is interdisciplinary work, which is defined by problems that cannot be addressed by any specific discipline. And I think that goes back to what Ila mentioned about the seed funding and about which I think is initiatives that are being initiated by the high-level rank institution level, right? So they say, okay, we need to tackle these problems that cannot be solved by any specific discipline. And the other way of looking at interdisciplinary work is incorporating knowledge from other disciplines to your own discipline to promote or to solve domain-specific problems. Which means basically advancing topics in architecture by incorporating knowledge from other disciplines. And I think that in architecture, that's mostly what people have in mind when they talk about interdisciplinary work. But on the other hand, I think that most of the value about conducting disciplinary work is on the other area, which is, again, problems that cannot be solved by any specific disciplines by itself. To my point of view, the problem that prevents academics, in architecture at least, from dealing with these problems has to do with tenure evaluation criteria. So my question to you as deans is, do you think that the academia as a structure, in terms of its tenure evaluation criteria, needs to change to promote interdisciplinary work? And if this is the case, then what directions do you consider?
Actually, I'd like to start to weigh in on this and sort of backing up a little bit to the first question in terms of the seed funding that comes forward for interdisciplinary research and some of the issues that show up at university level. This is something I've talked to a number of different university and presidents and provosts about. They really do believe that these funds will make it happen. But the issue in all cases, it's a sort of a start, but a misunderstanding of what constitutes the deliverable. In the end, they still want to have clarity in terms of what the deliverables are, and the role that we play as agents within the design world does not neatly fit within what they define as deliverables. So we'll have a seat at the table in the beginning, but at the end, things will continue on as they are. And that's very much, I think, the question as well about the tenure process, is how so much of it is defined in terms of very specific criteria that people become more and more comfortable with. Impact factor, for one. We never talked about impact factor in architecture, for years. Now our provosts are asking us to sort of like discuss impact factor, and it's very difficult to talk about the fact that what makes somebody interesting is because they precisely are operating in between. And if they're operating in between, that's where their greatest contribution is, they will have no impact factor. And I think this is something that, it is the tail wagging the dog in many things, but we have to do something about this, because otherwise it'll color everything that we do, including the seed grants in the end, if we don't sort of wrestle with how do we define, it's not a question of how, we talked about how we define our discipline, but how do we define the deliverable of that for which we don't have a defined set of criteria to start with?
I actually think we do have a defined set of criteria. We don't write them down in any explicit way. I just asked our promotion and tenure committee to put together a paper on design research in terms of policy, because in terms of evaluation, because the issue is, as I said, we borrow from standards from other disciplines in relation to research. So, and our typical ones are either from the humanities in relation to architectural history, theory, et cetera, from the social sciences, usually in planning, from applied science and building technology, or from the arts in architecture. And I think that that's a mistake in a way. And that we are at the center of design research, and we actually have to define that, and we haven't been doing a great job of that, and that's part of our challenge, but that's absolutely necessary, because continually borrowing from other disciplines will always put us at a disadvantage in terms of how we're being evaluated, because it's based on different conditions. When I was at Waterloo, an architecture school that was part of a larger faculty of engineering. I used to sit in a room, 8,000 engineering students, 450, 500 architecture students, and would sit in a room and I would just see the charts and the metrics, and there were certain standards. When UVA, part of this efforts around interdisciplinarity was also a series of challenges for cluster hires, and cluster hires were shared hires across different schools and different departments. So we did a cluster hire with health and education, in design thinking. We did another one in resilience with engineering. And the interesting thing with engineering is that from the engineering standpoint, they refused to hire anybody who wasn't an engineer and wasn't, evaluated based on certain engineering standards. And so, and we were sitting there, from the architecture standpoint saying, well, where's the design research in relation to this? And I think that when I say that part of the challenge has to do with how we're communicating across disciplines, but this is a larger challenge now for universities, for academic institutions in general. And I think we need to clarify it both on the side of design, but also to think about how we're operating as a network in relation to other disciplines to take on problems. Because the one thing I should have said in relation to things like our strategic investment fund proposals, the funds were being put forward, but the problems were being defined collectively by the institutions or by the people that were putting forward the proposals. And there have been a lot of discussions and debates that have come out of that, but I've never had so many conversations with people from other disciplines, at any academic institution, and that in and of itself, I think, is somewhat revolutionary.
And I think on that note, we're going to finish the session. Thank you so much.
Great. I'd like to say a few words, and then we'll let you take a short break. Thank you again to all the panelists, to the hosts of the sessions, the respondents. It's been an inspiring day, and I feel incredibly happy to be part of this community. So trying to kind of frame a little bit of what came up throughout these three different sessions, maybe I can put forward a couple of themes. The first is, I think, the sort of commonalities is that there's an incredible passion that is in everything you do. And no matter whether it's in the private sector, in the public sector, or in the academy, there's a passion about what you do. Yes, you've done well in what you do, but you care about the issues. And I think that is very important. And it's just inspiring and gives, in a sense, it's a message of hope, which is great, especially at this time in sort of the global situation, right? So I think that's very important, the kind of energy and drive that the DDes have to actually make a real impact. The second, I think, what I see is the kind of willingness to spend time on understanding the architecture of the problem. And I think that is very important, because only doing that actually allows you to come up with different solutions and pathways. And I think that has to do with the fact that in year one, we all struggle with finding that design of the research project. What actually is the research problem? That is a long process in DDes studies. And I think we're finding that commitment to actually really getting it right. We're seeing that, I think, happening in the way you practice and in the way you work. Third, maybe, is I think one of the commonalities between sort of everything we've heard today is, of course, that there's a level of leadership that is very compelling and it's convincing. And if leadership is managing change with limited resources, I think we've seen really compelling examples of that on very different scales, in very different sectors, in different geographies. But it's really wonderful to see there's a level of commitment and the tools and skills, the sort of agility of thinking that were displayed in all of these presentations. Really, I think it's true the DDes are doers and talkers, but they're also movers and shakers. I think that certainly one can say. Lastly, I think there's been a sort of pervasive reference to sort of technology and digital culture in a lot of the work. I mean, this is in part because we live in the times that we live in, and these things are around, and while they weren't instrumental in everything that we've seen, but they have been quite important actually throughout the three sessions. So I think that's just more or less an observation, but I think important is it's a critical, a reflective view on technology and digital culture. It's certainly not uncritical, so it's not just sort of going on a ride. It's really about leadership in moving different issues forward. So I think with that, we'll close, and I'd like to thank actually all the alumni again for coming out. It's been amazing to see so many of you. It's great to see our current students here. To the alumni, a special thank you also to any support you've given us over the past. I think that's very much appreciated. There's been a suggestion that maybe there should be another event of this sort, and I'm not opposed. I would say let's not do it in 30 years. I'm going to be selfish. Let's say maybe 10 years would be good space from here on. So I think that's, a great idea. There's been some interest expressed in kind of forming, let's say, a committee of alumni that help us maybe shape the sort of community over that decade and help shape the next event. That would be wonderful. So if you have any interest in getting involved, so please do let us know. We'd love to work with you. And so I think I'll leave it here. I will recognize everybody who contributed to sort of producing this event in the reception that we'll have at the porticos. We do have a short break now, believe it or not. We will have then some tours organized for you. We have 3 tours for you to just get a sense of the various things that are going on here. The first tour takes you to a building on 42 Kirkland Street, which houses the design labs and the Softness program. And we have 4 or 5 volunteers there who will just share work with you very casually. It's very relaxed, no formal presentations. So if you're interested in some of the design research work that's going on, then please, that's a tour for you. The second, there'll be a tour of the fabrication lab. Rachel Vroman and Sarah will run that. That takes you to the basement, of course, and to the expanded fabrication lab that now expands beyond the brick patio outside. Third, there is a group of current students prepared to talk a little bit more in detail about the new geographies set up in the library that we sort of saw yesterday, but I think over drinks and snacks we may not have appreciated that as much, so that is a third option. And I think probably in the interest of time we should have a single tour and sort of reconvene. So we'll take a 10-minute break. The tours, I think, to the Fab Lab and to the design labs will leave at the donut, and then we'll reconvene in the porticos for the kind of final reception. Thank you so much.